Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, from whichever time zone you may be calling us from today. We'd like to thank you that you're joining us. My name is Rebecca Cronin, and I'm one of the Customer Success Managers here with the Altair Data Analytics team. Customer Success team, we're here as another point of contact for you to reach out to at any time with any questions or concerns you may have regarding our Altair solutions, or if you're unable to get a hold of your account manager. So we're very excited you're joining us for our 2025 very first session for this year. Our goal is to provide you an open time slot where you may freely drop in, and we'll do our very best to provide any assistance in answering your questions after demonstrating our topic segment. So we'll be starting that shortly. Before we do, let's do a little housekeeping. On the side control panel, you'll locate the handouts section. We've included a copy of today's PowerPoint that you may download or retain for your copy. It does contain some helpful web links later in the document. You'll also see a question panel. This gives you the opportunity to submit any questions you may have. Note, it does not have to be about today's topic. It could be any questions related for any other functionality, capabilities, not just for AI Studio, but also for AI Hub. And we'll do our best to answer that. And if we don't have a chance to complete and get you a response, we will follow up within 2 to 5 business days. If you do submit a question that you'd like to be answered offline in private, then please make that comment when you submit that question. So now I'd like to introduce you to our expert, Jeff Chowaniec. He is one of our senior data scientists. He's worked for almost 10 years in various technical support roles, included our Altair RapidMiner. He's one of our original specialists. We're very fortunate to have his expertise. Jeff leads by example, providing tremendous assistance to both our customers and even our own internal teams. Some of you might have had the benefit of working with Jeff directly. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over presenter to Jeff. Well, we'll dive into the topic of his macros masterclass. So let me make you presenter. So you should be able to take the helm, Jeff. Awesome. And what I see is your AI Studio client.
Perfect. That is all I should need today. Hello, everyone. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to be using a couple of things I probably haven't used before on the Ask the Expert series. So I'm going to do a little bit of an intro on that. But today I'm going to cover macros in RapidMiner. Alternatively, you can call them global variables because that's what they are. Just a quick denote that it's not some scripting like macros in Excel. We're just basically talking about global variables that we can set in Studio to make Studio feel more complete as a no-code programming language, to basically allow us to do everything that you would do as Python coder, Java coder, R coder, whatever language it may be. This gives us the capability to essentially do all of those without having to write lines of code. Ironically, I'm going to start this with the Python scripting to show you what I'm talking about. So we are going to be doing a little bit of code at the beginning, which is hilarious. But there are a couple of other panels I'm going to be using. So if you're normally new to RapidMiner, you might be starting with this default view here. And there's a couple of extra panels I'm going to be adding to and changing. So for the first thing is I'm always going to tab this repository and operators panel. And there's a few other panels I'm going to grab. Specifically, I need my macros panel down here. I'm going to throw in the log panel as well for a reason you'll see in a second. Let me tab that. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted to do. Let me tab that right there. And then there was one more panel, which is going to be the context panel that I'm going to leverage in a bit. First things first, what are macros? I'm actually going to use a little bit of Python to kind of explain these in a better way. So normally when I'm building a function or something, I need to store information as variable names when I'm coding. So easiest thing to do here is I'm going to store a file name as test, and then I'm going to print file name. So fun fact, if I run this, that execute Python. Oh, what did it not like? I don't need to use macros. There we go. Okay. So when I run this and check my log, that prints out this test right here. So I'm saying create a variable called file name. That value is test. What I could also say is Jeff is the best. Ask the expert presenter. And then I say print that file name. And I hit apply and I run this. And you'll see in my log, it says I am, in fact, the best as the expert presenter. So this is effectively what we're mimicking. This, I can store information as a variable name. That's essentially all macros are, is this global variable setting. So I can say there's a piece of information, whether it's a string like I have here, or the standard deviation of a column in my data set, or I want to basically say, here's a list. I want you to send a list, each value of this list through a function. That's effectively what I'm doing. So every time I'll change that variable to the value in that list to send it through a function. So that's effectively what macros represent in RapidMiner. But in my option, I don't have to do any coding. So in this case, so those are what macros are, or at least their analogous equivalent in Python. How do we define them in RapidMiner? There are /AI Studio. I'm still calling it. In AI Studio, I've got a couple of options like my set macro or that context macro we created. So I could go into the set macro. If I go to generate data, for example, I'm going to send this data set out. I think this sends data into there, but let's see. So I could say set macro, go to parameters, and just say my macro is file name, and the value is test. Okay, I'm going to run this workflow now, and all that set macro does for me is if I go to my macro panel, I set that file name macro to test, which is good. So I can do the same thing. If I go to that set macro operator, I could easily say Rebecca is the best. Ask the expert moderator. And when I run this workflow, I should close out that output port. I don't need it. You'll see my file name is set to Rebecca is the best. Ask the expert moderator. Now I can move this around and use this in some cool ways, but this is just setting one variable name. I can set this at the beginning, or if I have a list of variables I want to set at the beginning of the process, I can also use this set macros operator. So I can do the same macro generation, but in a list format. So I could set a bunch of variables from the start. The other option is to actually use the settings of the process itself. So in my context panel, I can bind data sets. I can bind data sets to my input ports. I can bind results to my output ports. So I can set these up as just like a part of this workflow. I can also make macros an innate part of this workflow as well. So that same set macro list, I could say, hey, create file name here. I'm using this prod line later in my workflow, so I'm going to leave that there. So I could just say test. So when I run this breakpoint, so all we've done is generate data here. You can see file name is set to test. And then this is run, it's going to run my Python, and then it's going to run my set macro. So after my set macro runs, you can see my file name is then set to, it was set for a very brief second. And after that, so when I run this, you can see Rebecca is the best Ask the Expert moderator. So that changes the value of this macro in my context panel. But this allows me, I can just create a whole bunch of variables. So if I needed a file path, for example, and had to point to some file that changes, or I have like a temp set point that I need to keep track of, I could have that temperature set point stored here that I can access later. This is very similar to just taking that Python code and just saying, okay, here's the variable, here's what the value is. And that's all I'm essentially doing with the context panel and the set macros operator. Define the variable / macro that I want, and then its value. So this is the easiest way of just setting those values. There are other ways of also getting these macro values out. More specifically, there's the generate macro operator and the extract macro operator. So I could take that set macro output, I'm going to send it into generate macro, and I could come in here and say, give me the mean of a given column. And so if I come in here, I'm going to say, give me the mean. Is it average? I think it's average. Maybe. No, it's average. There we go. So I'm going to say, give me the average of attribute 1 and store that as a piece of information for me. So if I go and do a breakpoint here, variable attribute 1 is unknown. That's weird. Show example set result. I've got ATT1. It's real. Should be able to get the mean. Let's do sdev instead. Don't know why it's not finding that at the current moment. This is working, and now it's not. My statistical functions. Let's just do the max. I'll try that one and see. But call this one max and hit apply. Run this. there. That's strange. Likes ATT2. Well, I'm going to avoid that one because I don't know why we're breaking, and just use the extract macro. So normally I can create a macro function with the generate attributes stuff. For some reason, it's not recognizing my attributes. I don't know why. Apologies for that. My extract macro, though, allows me to do much similar. So I could easily just say, create a macro and extract out the number of examples. And so if I run this, what we should get is a new macro called num, which tells me I've got 100 examples. But I can also grab the number of attributes, or I could easily take a data value from the list. So I could say, hey, take the data value from attribute 1 and take it at example index 50. So if I run this, this will tell me what the value for attribute 1 is at example index 50. Alternatively, I can also extract out some statistics. So if, for example, my generate macro is not working, I could easily go to my statistics option and say, hey, I want to extract the mean of attribute 1. So when I stop and run this, I should now get the mean value for attribute 1 stored. So this is an easy way to get information out of my data set stored as variables. I can either use the extract macro or the generate macro if I want to create various different functions. I can get that information out of my data. So I can either set macros via my set macro panel or set macro operator or my context panel. I can generate them or extract them out of my data set. So how do I actually leverage these macros? So generally when I'm engaging with clients and we're going through a workshop on how to learn RapidMiner, usually the first way that comes up when I'm teaching is operators that generate macros for you. And so the first one that I usually leverage is the loop files operator. So what the loop files operator does is I basically say, hey, look in a directory and point at where I want to pull files in. I tell it, hey, what specific files do I want to pull? I'm looking for files with the word labeled in them. And then I have this enabled macros. So when this runs, what it ultimately does is it reads in files, sends them through a read CSV, and stores them. So if I do a breakpoint after this, for example, I'm also going to go to my context panel and I'm going to get rid of these test macros really quickly. So if I run this, it'll load that data in for me. Great. It just pulled a text file in and parsed it as a CSV file. But you'll notice in my parameters for my loop files, I have a macro for file name, file type, and folder name. So you can see here, I have file name, which is Amazon sells labeled.txt, a file type, which is txt, and the folder name, so where I got this file from. So it automatically stores these for me, which is great. So this is usually the first way that I'm introducing it is I need this information. And so when the loop files points to that file, it saves all of that information about that file as these macros that I can leverage in my workflow. So the way we actually leverage these macros is by calling them in the parameters of operators like so. So if I want to use the file name operator, I simply do %, curly bracket, name of the macro, and then I close that curly bracket. So if I want to call all three of these, I can say pull the file type. Spelling is a big deal. And then finally, I can pull the folder name. So if I run anything with these, it'll just basically input that file name. In particular, if I take a store operator and say, okay, point to where I want to store the object and then name it this file name, the value stored in file name. So for this particular file, I want to store it as Amazon sells labeled.txt. And so as long as I put in this macro value, this %, curly bracket file underscore name, what it should do when I run this store operator is it should store that data set. If I go back to my design view and go to my repository panel, I should now have a results folder and you'll see Amazon sells labeled. When I run my next file through, it stores the file name as IMDb labeled. And then when it stores the data set, it gets stored as IMDb labeled. Same thing for the third one. I've got Yelp underscore labeled.txt, and when I store it, it stores it as that file name. I only have the 3 files in here, so it's finished that storing loop for me, which is good. So you can quickly see basically the operator itself handles the macro generation or extraction. So it's effectively doing this generate or extract macro or the set macro option with the information that the loop files found. So instead of running these operators myself, the loop files just has them built in with this macro for file name, file type, and folder name. So it grabs these and generates them for me, which is really nice. There are a bunch of other operators that do this automatic macro generation as well. Like for example, I have this loop attributes. This one in particular, if I run this workflow, what I want to do is I want to calculate the number of standard deviations that each sensor is away from the mean. And so in this case, what loop attributes does is it basically just allows me to create a list of values to loop over. In this case, that list is going to be the sensors that I select, that I want to make this calculation for. So I could just select a single sensor. I could select a subset and hard code it. In my case, I just said, hey, take all the columns, make a list of columns that have the word sensor in them. So you can see I've got sensor 1 through 25 here. My matched items are 1 through 25. So this is what I'm going to loop over. This is what my macro value is going to be set to. So the loop attributes also creates a loop attribute macro. So each item in this list will be set to the loop attribute macro will be set to each item in this list as we go through the loop, because we're looping through that list. That's the variable we're setting. So how we actually use that is inside our loop attribute. I actually also have 2 other extract macros. So just like that extract macro, I said, hey, create a macro called mean. It's a statistic. And then take the average of the attribute we're looping over. So you'll notice I'm creating a macro, and in that macro's extraction, I'm also using a macro that the loop attributes generated. So when I go to this breakpoint before, what I'll have is a data set. And in my loop now, all I've done is set loop attribute to sensor 1. So when I run this get average operator, that means loop attribute is going to plug in this sensor 1 value here. So then I should get the mean of sensor 1. So if I run this and look at my macro, I'm on sensor 1 and I have the mean for sensor 1 as well. Same thing for the standard deviation. If I run that one, it's doing the same exact thing, plugging in the loop attribute and getting my deviation. So I can see my standard deviation, my mean, and then my generate attributes puts this all together for me. So if I go into my edit list button, I just simply say, I want to know for my column name, say sensor 1 standard deviation away. And each loop we'll basically make this sensor 2 standard deviation away, sensor 3 standard deviation away, sensor 4 standard deviation away as I go through the loop. So I can use these macros in my column name, and I can use these macros in my function generation. So you can quickly start to see how easy it is to start automating workflows with the use of these macros, just like you would with variable definitions in a Python script or Java, etc. But here I wrote a pretty simple function. I'm just taking the values of the column that I'm looping over. So in this case, sensor 1. And what you'll notice here is I have a number sign, a pound sign, a hash code, whatever it's being called these days, in front of my loop attribute instead of a percent sign. So whenever I have a macro that is representing a column name, I can use this pound sign to say, hey, this is a numerical column, evaluate it as a numeric, not as a string. The eval function is doing something similar because this mean is when I have a macro value, it's just stored as a string, but I know that the mean and standard deviation are in fact numbers. So the eval function just says, hey, treat this string as if it's a numerical value. So that way I can use it in a numerical operation, like for example, taking the value in sensor 1, subtracting the mean from it, and then dividing that result by the standard deviation. I have an absolute value in here because I don't care about if it's negative, if this value from this subtraction is negative or positive, and then I have the rend function to just round to the nearest integer. So I can know how many standard deviations away we are from the mean for this value. So here I'm calling a column name and evaluating it with the pound sign instead of the percent sign. And then I'm using the 2 macros we just extracted in this same function. I can hit apply, and when I run this, what's cool, if I run this after, we should have a new feature that's created because we used the macro name or the macro loop attribute in the column name side as well. We get a new column called sensor 1 standard deviation away, and I can see how many standard deviations away, which is cool. And the nice part about this is the whole point of doing the loop attributes is that this loop operates over every sensor column that I have matched in this list. So if I run this now, I will get this output, which will have a sensor standard deviations away for every sensor in my data set. So I can just see how many standard deviations away this value is for that sensor. So that way I'm now leveraged the extract macro, the evaluate function, as well as the pound sign to denote a numerical column in the form of a macro. So pretty cool stuff. You can quickly start to see how valuable this variable generation is for automation. I was able to make, instead of having to hard code this for one item, I was able to extract it for each column, write one function and send all 25 columns through this function to generate 25 new columns. What's cool is I can use macros all over the place. Not limited to just the data generation that I was just doing. In this bottom track, I can use this to basically set filters on data. So I can generate 1 million rows of data, which I do here, and I generate an ID. So if I do a breakpoint there and run this, you can see I have 1 million rows. I've got an ID for every row. It tells me what my label is, what the attribute is. And so now if I go to my set macro operator, I can just say, hey, where do I want to start and stop this? I want to take row 750 and go to row 900, right? And I can hit apply. And in my filter example range, all I've done is say, okay, I have 2 macros, start and stop. tell me where to get this information. So go to start, go to stop, and when I run this, I should now have 201 examples starting at row 750. That's why I generate the ID, so I can have effectively the row number and the raw data. And the bottom of my data set is row 950. This is particularly valuable when I need to dice up my data set and that window might change the data that I need. This is particularly helpful when working with time series data or dates in general. If, for example, I have a batch of a product I'm generating and I have a product complaint, so I have a date timestamp for when that product is being manufactured in a time series data set, and I have a product complaint, I can take that product complaint and say, okay, look a day forward and a day, I know that product ID, I know the day it was manufactured, so give me a window of 24 hours as a start and a stop, and then pull all the manufacturing data for that day. So this is an example of using it in the real world. I would more so use this for dates. So I can create a start date and a stop date to filter on. So then I could write a simple filter that says, hey, pull the start date, start date time is greater than or equal to start date and less than or equal to the stop date. So I can get all the time series data that matches up. So I can use these macros in all of my operators, basically. So I'm going to go ahead and disable this. And so my last line is, if I have something like this, where after this and run this, where I have basically time series data where I've got production line 1, temperature, RPM, pressure, and production line 2, temperature, RPM, pressure. These might represent two different processes, so I want to grab only the columns I need when I'm working with line 1 versus when I'm working with line 2. The nice part about this is I can jump to my context panel and use this as an example this time. I could say line is my macro, and then this is going to be prod line 1. And my select attributes operator will basically just say, use a regular expression to grab the features that I want. So my regular expression should type in this macro. So I'm plugging in this macro. So I can put my macros even into my regular expressions, not just like fields, not just like other more basic parameter options. So here I'm just saying, look for anything that starts with whatever this macro value is, followed by any characters. So I have prod line 1 currently set to my line macro. So I should only take these prod line 1 variables and ignore the prod line 2. So when I run this, undefined macro line. Oh, that was why. I had started that workflow before I had defined the macro. That's something to note. If I don't have anything in the workflow generating the macro, if I add it to the context panel during a breakpoint, it doesn't know that that exists. So that's something to note, that you have to define the stuff in the context panel before you press play, not after. So once that variable is locked in, my select attributes should basically take that macro, plug it into that regular expression, and what I'll get out is prod line 1, which is cool. Not only can I plug these variables into stuff like regular expressions, I could also plug them into my Python notebooks as well. So if I come in here and say, actually, you know what? I can just leave the line in there. I can go to the execute Python and say use macros. And in here, what I can say is I've got macros as well. And instead of calling the file name, what we're going to call is %, curly bracket, line, close curly bracket. And I think I need to wrap this in quote, if I'm not mistaken. And if I run this, what we should see in our log at the bottom is prod line 1 getting printed by our print function. So then I could easily go to my context panel and say, maybe this is the best ask the expert webinar I attended. And if I run this, that value that I just changed in my context panel now shows up in my log file, so you can see it getting printed. So I can, not only can I pass these macros into generate attribute functions, the parameters of operators, and into regular expressions, but I can also pipe them into Python scripting. So in the event that I need to leverage some algorithm that's outside of RapidMiner via Python, if I'm doing like computer vision, want to build some PyTorch models, or I'm doing some stuff with Gen AI with the Gen AI extension in RapidMiner, I can always pipe in macros into my Python scripts. I can pipe them into SQL database queries. I could pretty much just put them anywhere. They're just as universally useful in programming languages when I define a variable name as they are in RapidMiner. And basically, these are one of my favorite advanced topics to teach because it really opens up so many avenues for AI Studio users to effectively be top-notch data science programmers without really having to write any lines of code. Once you grasp and understand the generation and usage of macros in AI Studio, you're pretty much limitless. I use these every day. They are such an integral part of how I design workflows and automate my data science projects. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. This is a topic I love, and I know a lot of other experts, AI Studio experts, and colleagues of mine use these as effortlessly as breathing to really basically expand what you can do in AI Studio in terms of process generation. So thank you for listening to my rambling. Hopefully you've learned something and enjoyed this. I'll turn it over to Rebecca to handle any questions you guys have. Feel free to ask any, how do I do this? How do I do that? It doesn't have to be pertinent to macros, or if you want to know more or how to use more, feel free to ask away.
Well, while folks are thinking of questions, how about let's launch the poll question to see what topic we will present for next session. So if you had your screen at full view to see what Jeff was presenting, you will have to minimize it down to be able to select one of the options. So if you can select the topic, would you like to learn more about model optimization, hyperparameter tuning? Would you like to learn about feature selection options or handling images? And then our other, at the end of the session, we do have a closing survey. So when you exit out, it should be sending you a prompt to give us some feedback, let us know how the session was, suggestions for future topics that we can add to the poll. And so it looks like the voting is getting completed. So we'll do a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it looks like our next topic is the model optimization and hyperparameter tuning. All right. So hopefully it gave some folks to kind of come up with some questions. And if there's no questions, if you're still thinking, let me share my screen real quick. Let's make me presenter just to show some closing slides, unless you thought of something to share. All right, so again, if you didn't have a chance, there's a copy of today's PowerPoint that you can download. It's got some updated helpful web links. Our user community portal had changed. So there's a new one that you would use to connect to open your support tickets. Again, our Ask the Expert. So we hope to have this will be consistent. It will be the second Wednesday of the month. Granted, this is a new year. Maybe it was too early. A lot of folks getting back into the swing of things. So hopefully we see you for February. Again, this is that new support portal, what it looks like. So if you have to create a ticket, but you also have the ability to leverage the community to ask your question. Our helpful community has documentations, upcoming events, documentation on AI Hub Studio, the Academy to further enable your learning. And if you search within the community itself, there are a couple links to some of these courses that you could also leverage. And Marketplace is where you'll find our latest AI Studio client if you wanted to upgrade. And so for events, our next sessions, the landing page should be updated and ready to go, where you can also register for our February 12th and March 12th sessions. And that's all I have. So Jeff, I don't know, do you see any questions? Was there any other tips that you might want to share? When you're on mute, if you were going to share.
Yeah, I think, I think I went long today because I really like this topic, so I was really happy to show it. So I tried to make sure I had pretty much a lot of examples of how to use these. So I don't have any other tips on the macro stuff today, and it doesn't look like there are any questions, so I'm happy to wrap early.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you again for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful remainder of the day and your week. And we hope to see you in February. Thank you, Jeff. Great job.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good one.